And then I am just gonna talk directly into the camera for a second.
Okay.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Inner Loops YouTube channel. I'm Kira, and today, as part of our Author's Corner series, I'll be having a conversation with Danielle Badra about her new collection of poetry, Like We Still Speak. For more Dani and more Author's Corner, you can check out our website to find articles, interviews, podcast episodes, and, very most importantly, a link to purchase the book. Welcome, Dani!
Thank you. Bye.
Hi, yeah, we're so happy to have you here. I would love to first start by talking about form. I actually have like an infinite amount of questions about form because this
Sure.
collection is so experimental and so interesting. It is just absolutely bursting with language from Facebook posts, from translations, from notebook entries, from Lebanese fables, and most centrally, the poetry of your late sister. How do you approach form when incorporating all of these different voices?
So that is a great question. The essential thing to know when it comes to how I started working with other voices is when my sister died, it was urgent that I write with her, that I speak with her again. And I thankfully found a bunch of poems of hers when I was cleaning out her apartment that I never even knew she'd written. And in those poems, she discussed feeling like she had died or like she was going to die, and like just things that like I needed to talk to her about.
Yeah.
Things that she hadn't shared with me that I needed to have answers to. And so the entire process of me writing alongside another voice was really just me trying to connect with my dead, essentially, like trying to do some sort of like seance almost. um, and then I obsessively wrote like that for 3 years. I wrote like 400 contrapuntal poems with my sister exclusively. And by the time I got to grad school, my professors basically said, you need to stop doing this because you can't just write this one way and with this one person for your whole life. And even though I know you really want to, you gotta try to change. And so that's really where I started to not only change the contrapuntal form, but also bring in other voices. And I found my own way to do what they were asking, but also keep doing what I wanted to do. So,
Yeah, that's so interesting. Was found poetry a part of your practice before then, or was it something you like discovered at that moment and then just could not let go of?
so I actually did start writing both experimental form and with found poetry a little bit in undergrad. There was one poem that I wrote. Sorry, anytime I think back on my undergrad poems, I just chuckle a little bit.
A moment of silence for all the poems we've written in undergrad.
Yeah, but there was one poem that I wrote that was in the contrapuntal form, though I did not know what the contrapuntal form really was until grad school. I was writing it, but I didn't know what it was. So I wrote a contrapuntal poem that included a line from Lauryn Hill's To Zion, as well as a line from the Bible, and then myself. Um,
What a lineup. What a
yeah,
lineup.
yeah. What was the question? Sorry.
If you had written found poetry
Oh yeah,
before
yes.
finding the poems of your sister, yeah.
So there you go. I did. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. And then was her poetry practice like a part of your relationship? Did you guys like read each other's poetry before that point? I know you had told the story of her like writing you a poem for your birthday one year.
Yeah.
Or was that like a complete surprise? Like, oh God, my sister writes poetry, like since when?
So I knew that she wrote poetry in undergrad, and I knew that she wrote me that poem for my birthday for my 23rd birthday, which I honestly thought was just her way of trying to get out of buying me something. Um,
Very
so
sisterly.
yeah, she was my older sister, and I was like just the brat younger sister, and I was really kind of not nice about it at the time. But yeah, her later years, the poems that I found when she died, she stopped sharing her poetry with me for a while. And some of her friends said that because she read my poetry all the time. She was like my top editor, my my number one. But her friends told me that she was like intimidated by my writing essentially, and that's why she stopped sharing it with me. But I wish she hadn't, because it was really good. So yeah.
Yeah. And I'd love to talk more about the contrapuntal form that you find combining your work with hers. I loved what you said about them kind of expanding into three poems of like the poem on the left, the poem on the right, the poem that exists between them. I spent a lot of time with those poems, like reading them in different orders, probably orders we're not even supposed to be reading them in, but like there's this really satisfying sense of like searching for combinations and always finding them.
Yeah.
Which is it's a thrilling part of the reading experience, and it's also quite tender.
Yeah.
But even within the genre, you have variation and you experiment. Like the one with the line down the center. I don't know why I got very comfortable with the form. I was like, oh yeah, I got this. And that one like really struck me. Or the ones with like colons separating the sections from each other. What did that experimentation look like for you in the process of writing these?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to read it in multiple directions. I know for some people that is maybe one of those things that says, oh, well, I don't want to read this more than one way, or some people like to be given the direction for how to read something. But I really did write them intentionally for people to kind of, choose your own adventure, if you will, and to be able to have the reader be part of the process of developing meaning, you
Hmm.
know? So thank you for spending time with the poems.
Yeah, of course.
Um, so yeah, but experimenting with the contrapuntal was basically everything that I did starting in grad school and then developing the manuscript after grad school as well. To just find, basically I had the idea for this book as being a gallery of voices, a gallery of, my friends, my family, but also poets that I admired, artists that I admired, and just kind of making a poetic rendering of an artistic gallery, right, of these voices. And so I put out a call for submissions. I asked for, it was just like a Facebook event that I created.
That's amazing.
Yes. And the event had a start time and an end time. And I was just like, okay, you guys, 3 months, like give me whatever you want. It could be like a recipe, that you love. It could be a comedic routine. It could be a dance routine. It could be any form of creative expression that speaks to you. My one guideline was that I just kind of wanted people to try to speak to their own experience of like being marginalized in whatever way or living in the margins, as I find myself living sort of in the margins between several different cultures, like all the time. And so I wanted to speak with that sort of theme in mind. But that was really the only guideline I gave people. And I got maybe 40 or 50 submissions from a wide variety of people who I'd known for a short amount of time, people I'd known my whole life. And I tried my best to respond to all of them. However, not all of them, I couldn't, you can find your way into some of them, you can find your way into, others not so well. So I did try with all of them, but some of them just stand out on their own and can't find that conversation. But so really the contrapuntal form changed for me depending on the content that was submitted. I found that the form really depended on who I was having the conversation with. Um,
Yeah, I'm interested to hear more about what freedoms versus limitations that you found working with text in that way, especially text from people who are so close to you, because I feel like there would be some element of like their expectation weighing over your art making of like, I'm gonna send you my favorite song ever and you have to make a poem out of it. Like, by the way, I'm your uncle. Like that feels
yeah,
like heavy in some ways, but really interesting in others. Like, how did that process come through? Like, what did you find freeing or limiting about it?
yeah. Well, so like I do still feel a little bad for some of the people whose content I didn't end up being able to use, or people whose content I did use and then it didn't make it into the book. But I made sure to thank everyone at the end of the book who did submit, because that was a huge part of this process, was just getting people to be vulnerable and open up to me. And that's hard to do. But especially for the people who ended up being included in the book, I made sure to reach out to everyone and say, hey, you're going to be in this. Are you okay with it? B, here's what it looks like. Is this okay? And making sure that, I'm citing them however they want to be cited. And yeah, it was nerve wracking, especially poems with like my family.
Mhm.
Those tend to be a little tender. But you can't, edit yourself too much. Obviously I would respect anybody who said, take this out, I don't want to be included. If their voice is included in the poem, I would have removed it. But everyone gave me the A-okay. So
Yeah, and what was it like having them like give you feedback on the poems in that way, like the first time they read it?
I mean, nobody had any negative feedback for me, so
Success. And I think that's really admirable of you to be so straightforward about it. I know that is often a point of controversy in the writing community, like how much do we owe to the people who inspire our work? Maybe the whole kidney debacle with like that question being at the center. And the fact that you leaned all the way of like, I'm gonna show it to them, I'm gonna tell them explicitly, I'm gonna give them like the ability to consent and the ability to say no if they don't want to participate. The love and tenderness of that I feel like really comes through in the text.
yeah. When so the purpose of me writing these contrapuntals in the first place with my sister, it was this urgent need to speak to her, but I also wanted to publish her, right? I wanted to find a way to make her poems publishable, because as they came to me, they were not exactly in that form. So part of these dialogues, like with a Facebook post that my mom made, like that's not something that gets published, like just a Facebook post necessarily. But when I'm able to speak to it, like it was language that I felt I wanted to share of hers, right? I thought what her message was really beautiful. And so turning it into a poem and giving it this space on the page allows me to publish her as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I don't know, I'm full of love. And
Yeah, no, that comes
share that.
through, and they are just so beautiful. And the conversation between them is so striking with the contrast, which is something that you know, but it's really lovely.
Thank you.
Yeah. Some other forms even outside of the contrapuntal that I was really interested in and wanted to hear more about. I think the first is Some Days Honey, Some Days Onion,
Yeah,
which is written in the back, is traditionally in Arabic form. Can you talk more about that? And
sure.
it's read right to left, if that's correct.
Yes, so it's actually a form that was created by poet Marwa Halal, and it is not typically written in Arabic. It is the title of the form. She came up with it. It's called the Arabic form, and it's written in English, but it's written from right to left, and it includes a line of Arabic script. So that's the end line of the poem. But the title of the poem is the Arabic in English. So yeah, it was just kind of like challenging. Well, it was challenging the notion of how to read a poem, especially when a lot of Arabic poetry has to be translated in order to be accessible to the English speaking community. And so it's challenging the notion of making that translation, but not making it be as accessible as being forced to be written from left to right, which is how the English script is usually written. So see, when I found that form by Marwa, I thought, wow, this is so cool. And I just wanted to try it. And I was very happy with what happened with it. It turned out good.
Yeah, is that from like a publishing perspective, something that you had to like push for to be like, hey, like this is important to me. The poem's gonna read right to left. No, I'm not gonna tell people that. They have to like experience it. Or like when you sent it out to magazines, like I'm interested in that because culturally, yeah, it is such an interesting and like dynamic choice. And whether you got any pushback, whether you had to like fight for that piece.
So thankfully, where it was initially picked up and published was MISNA, which is a journal that tends to publish Swana diaspora authors. And so it was very fitting that they chose that poem to publish. I felt like it had a really good home there. As for the publishers of the book, I actually didn't have any pushback for that poem. The poems that I really had pushback on were ones that were really wide on the page.
Mm.
And the publishers at one point even told me that, you know, I had to completely reformat these poems, which I said to them, like, in order to keep the column structure,
Yeah.
these contrapuntal poems, which is essential to how you read the poems, I cannot cut back on the width of the book. And so I made it as narrow as I could. But you know, if I hadn't, it probably would have been a little bit longer, maybe out to here. But they
Mhm.
wanted it, you know, to be like here. They wanted it to
Yeah.
be typical width. And that just wasn't gonna happen with this book.
Good.
Yeah. And thankfully my editors, Hyan and Fatty, they both stood up for me and said, listen, you if you're gonna publish this book, you have to use the margins that work for the poems. So
Yeah, especially because it's so central to some of the forms.
yeah,
I'm thinking, yeah, too, also of the Phillips Collection, which was another one I wanted to ask you about,
yeah,
which makes explicit use of the fact that the book is a square. Well, actually, I'm not a good measurement estimator. I don't know if it is a square. It's close to a square. And I'll hold it up to the camera here for anyone who doesn't have the book. But like the poem continues around the, or maybe it begins around in a square, like as a frame to the poem. Can you talk a little bit more about that form?
yeah. So thank you for asking about that one. That's one of my favorites. Originally it was just the central part of the poem. When the manuscript was sent to Hyan and Fatty, they suggested that it be put into this sort of Rothko type look with the poem. So they kind of helped me to determine the form of it, because it was all just one long block poem at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I chopped it up into these two blocks. And then I decided to not only make it look like a Rothko painting with the two like blocks, but then also use my sister's last poem that she wrote to form the frame around
Oh, wow.
the block, because the block is about her, you know, her last day in the Phillips Collection, which is where she worked, and just about that experience of writing her last poem. And so I figured, well, let's put the last poem as the frame around the poem. Is very meta. Um, and yeah, I think it looks great, and it makes me happy because Rachel loved the Rothko room. Rachel is my sister. I didn't mention that before. She loved the Rothko room at the Phillips Collection, and so making that poem look like a Rothko was fun. And I'm
Yeah.
happy that I could do that.
Yes, me too. It is so striking, and I love hearing the backstory behind
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Oh, amazing. Okay, and the last one I wanted to ask you about. This is literally just like I'm just like I want to hear about the greatest hits because I some of these are so interesting. Like I want to emphasize to people watching that reading this book is such like a pleasurable surprise where every page turn is like not what you expect it to be and is so interesting. And I wanted to talk to you about Station as well, which I think you had mentioned in another interview of like how that poem came together, how it found its structure, how it's
Which
like unique.
station?
Or, you know, I was looking through it earlier and now I'm like, there are multiple and I should have been more
There are
specific.
multiple.
I'm thinking specifically of this one.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yes. Which let me hold up more clearly for the audience in my little webcam. I don't even know how to describe this shape, but it is a shape. And I'd love to hear you speak more about it.
Yeah. It's like a chevron, perhaps. You know, one of those like pointy, like the head of an arrow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So well, first of all, the whole Station series, it might be helpful to have the background on that. My father was a Roman Catholic priest for a while, and then when he left the priesthood and had children, he still would go to our church every Good Friday and deliver his Stations of the Cross that he put together. And there's 14 stations in that. And so one year I decided to use his stations and create like an epic poem for each of the stations. And there used to be 14 of them, but I selected just a few to include in this book. But the middle of this arrow, there's words that say, I too am marked forever. I carry your image within and without me. So that language is directly from my father's stations. And for each one of these stations, I include some of his words from his Stations of the Cross. But the shape of the poem itself came before I included those words. And essentially you can read it top to bottom, bottom to top, all the way down from the top to the right, and then back to the left. Or, like you can read it pretty much whatever way you want. And I use these lines going down to help direct the reader down when they read instead of left to right. And so I hope that people find their way into that. I know it's not your initial instinct to do that. And oftentimes when I'm at readings, if I read this, people will be like, oh. But my favorite way of reading it is top to bottom, bottom to top, top to bottom, bottom to top, kind of like going like that. But everybody can find their own favorite way of reading it, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I hear people talk a lot about like a book teaches you how to read it. And I think this one is like, it is teaching you on every page. And it is, it's like a choose your own adventure. There's a real delight in that.
Yeah.
Interestingly, so when you come up with a concept for a poem, do you find that you think of the form and the form informs the language, or you think of the language and you have to try to find a form that will present it to the reader in that shape?
That's a great question. I think what I usually do, and it's different for each poem, but I definitely start with the language. I start forming the language, and usually within like a stanza, a form will kind of come to me. And then I will continue to build the poem towards the form, but not to the point where it like restricts the language. And if I do get to that point, then I'll usually stop and consider whether or not I need to abandon the form or what needs to happen. But yeah.
Have you ever written the beginning of a poem and then like had it completely change form? You're like, this is a circle now. Or like a poem kind of like showed you a form that was really drastically different than what you expected?
Yeah, I mean, the Phillips Collection one really just started, I think, as like, 4-line stanzas that were just straight down the page. And that is not what the end form is. And same thing with most of these station poems. They also started as, just how you would, a normal kind of boxy poem that I've always experimented with the blank space on a page, including in undergrad. I've always been interested in the meaning that can be formed from that blank space. And I think especially in these dialogue, conversational poems, that space helps you to form that conversation. It's like a breath between the columns, a breath between conversations. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that comes across both on the individual page with each poem, but then also on a larger scale in the book, like in the spaces between the pages.
yeah.
And I'm curious from an organization perspective. I know you've mentioned some of these poems are from a series that you had to like remove only a few of. Some of the poems are from like a collection that you wrote that were inspired and you had to pull only a few. How did you choose these poems to find a home with each other in the book? And how do you think about like the arc of the book through the system that you split it up into these 3 sections?
Yeah. So originally the manuscript that I submitted actually for this contest, I had a lot more like political poems in it. There was a whole section. It actually started with like a huge thick section of like politically activated poems that the editors, thankfully, I really do respect that they brought to my attention the fact that that really felt like a different book than what the vast majority of the rest of it was, which was more of like a kind of meditation on love and loss um and grief, and you know, in all the different ways, right? And the personal grief, the global grief, the and the ways in which we heal. And so once I realized that, the book started to take a completely different form for me in terms of the arc. And that's why I decided to open with the poem between my sister and I, her poem that she wrote to me for my 23rd birthday. And then ending with a poem with my now wife. I just wanted to have these bookends of love, right? Being the main trajectory, and one of them, you know, is experiencing severe loss, and in another, there's like, you know, this gain. It just felt balanced to kind of have that be the parts that hold the book together, I suppose.
Yeah, and that feels so central to the experience of reading it. So it's interesting to hear that earlier drafts of it were not organized that way.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
No. Yeah.
And thinking too about organization, like what's tying together the reading experience, I found for me that the experience of reading the collection was really tied to images,
Mm,
especially the images that repeat, that are reinvented. There are some forms where you explicitly are like, I think, using the same phrases from your sister's poem, but like in new ways, in new combinations,
mhm.
and presenting them each time in a way that feels familiar and yet expansive for the reader. Like this book is such a journey. I don't know if I can communicate that fully. Um, like some of the things absolutely brand new, and then some of the things you're like, oh, I've seen this before, but it's organized in a new way. It's giving me a new perspective on the same image. It's kind of like rotating it to catch the light.
Yeah.
So as a writer, how do you approach that idea of returning to these images, topics, themes, and especially in a collection like this, where it's kind of so explicitly centered around your experience with other people's words?
Yeah. So a lot of those moments that you find kind of repeated throughout the collection, I ended up adding after the fact, like when I was doing the final like work on the collection after it had been accepted. And once it was all organized in the way that I wanted it to be, kind of going through, reading the whole thing through again and seeing where I can kind of weave together some of these images, and how to kind of bring the whole book together by including these images throughout it. So I think one of them is like figs.
Hmm.
Yeah. I should reread my book to remember
The sticky bar stool, Dani, is in my brain.
Sticky
It's the sticky
Barstool.
bar stool.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, in that poem is rewritten like 3 different ways as well.
Hmm.
That started as just one poem. But that was where I was trying to really direct the reader, because it's a difficult 3-column contrapuntal that's very long and, you know, can very easily lose the reader. And so that's why I wanted to rewrite it so that you're reading it in all the ways I want you to read it. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that it goes along with this idea of like the book teaches you how to read the poems. And sometimes that means putting them in different orders so that you have to approach them in a new way. I think
Yeah.
that's really cool. And it's interesting to hear too that a lot of these things are things. So you said you added in late in the process, like when the manuscript was already done?
Yeah, so one wonderful thing about the Attila Non Prize is that you get to work with the editors, Hyan and Fatty, very closely after the manuscript has been selected. So about a month after my father died, in October of 2020, I had an 8-hour long Zoom session with my editors to go over line by line every single poem in the manuscript, and to decide, you know, which poems we thought still worked in the collection, if there were any new poems I could write to add into it, or poems that I'd already written that I thought maybe could now be included in this new thing that we were creating, and poems that were, were just working, don't need to do anything. Those ones I was like, whew, okay. But yeah, there was still work to be done. I think I had about a month and a half to really polish what was going to end up being the final book. And so in that time, I added a few new poems and tried to, like I said, kind of draw this string through the whole collection. So
Yeah, that actually brings me to my last question, which
yeah.
is something I ask every author. Because for the Authors Corner project, we are promoting authors who have published with small or independent presses.
Mhm.
And usually I'm like, can you talk me through your publication process? But I've got a chunk of the middle there. I wonder if you could start at the beginning. Like, once you sat down and you were like, okay, this manuscript is done. How
Mhm.
did that go from that point all the way to like you're holding the book in your hands?
Sure. Well, the book really wasn't done until until literally right before it went to print. But yeah, when I felt like solid about it, I actually started to submit it right when I finished my thesis in grad school. And it was a finalist with my first submission for the Berkshire Prize, Tupelo Press. And that's when I knew, okay, I've got something good here. I got to keep submitting. So I submitted it probably like 100 times. Every like 6 months or so, I would go back to the collection and make changes. And kind of try to figure out like where maybe it's getting to that finalist stage, but not actually making it to publication, what can change. And then I think about a year before, it took like 3 years or 4 years to get published. And about a year before I got accepted for the Attila Don Prize, the editors had actually contacted me to let me know that they really liked my manuscript, but they had some notes for me, which, okay, I will take your notes. So I went back and I did some more revisions to the manuscript. And then when I submitted it again the following year, it ended up being accepted. And I'm just so thankful. I'm getting off track a little bit, but I'm just so thankful that it was accepted when it was, because it was as my father was dying and he had like just enough capacity left to understand the gravity of what had happened, and to know that it was a book that was being published, in part because of my Arab heritage, and he was the Arab half of me. And I'm just so thankful that the timing happened as it did. But getting back on track, the publication process after, I found out maybe in July of 2020, I'd submitted in like March for the prize, and in July is when I found out that I got it. And then they did like an announcement in August, and then my father died, and so I like couldn't start working on it for a while. But once I had the time and the emotional capacity to get back into this book, it was kind of just a fast-paced, okay, we gotta get this thing published. Here's like 2 months, go. And so yeah, it was kind of like a landslide from there, but a beautiful landslide, and I felt supported the whole way. And it was a wonderful press to work with. University of Arkansas Press and Hyen and Fatty were just excellent editors. So I really appreciate all of the help that I received. And the proofreaders also for University of Arkansas Press were really great. So,
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm so glad that you had such a good experience and that it happened at like just the right time. Then the universe sent it to you, or you sent it into the universe. You had control.
it was a mutual exchange.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, thank you so much. That brings us to time. My final question for you is, where can people find you on the internet if they'd like to read more of your work, and where can they buy your book?
Excellent question. I have a website, daniellebadra.com, super high tech. So check it out. You can also, I am on Instagram at Dani Badra. I'm on Facebook too, but I don't really do as much on there. But I will every now and then post, whatever I have had published recently on Facebook. But DanielleBadra.com, my website, is really where I try to update with any readings coming up or any past publications or books coming out, all that stuff. So, and you can
Perfect.
contact me there too if you want to contact.
Okay, amazing. I believe, and also everyone, if you are watching this in this month when it's published, if you're watching it in the future, I can't do anything for you. But if you're watching it this month, you can pick up a signed copy of the book here in DC at the Potter's House.
That's right.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
And if you'd like to see more of us, the Inner Loop, you are already here on the Inner Loop's YouTube channel. You can just subscribe down there. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at the Inner Loop Lit. You can find us on Facebook at the Inner Loop DC, and you can find all of our links in the description of this video. So thank you, Dani, so much for being here. It was such a pleasure
Thank
to talk to
you. Excellent questions. Thank you.
you. Thank you. Okay, bye, everybody.
Bye.